Hi everyone, TinaPhysio here. Today we're going to talk about trigger finger or trigger thumb. Trigger finger or trigger thumb, depending which finger it's happening in, is also known as tenosynovitis. So what is trigger finger? If we look at the term tenosynovitis, which sounds like a mouthful, if we break it down, it'll give you an idea of what trigger finger actually is. Teno refers to tendon. Synovo refers to the lining around the tendon area, and itis is inflammation. So a trigger finger, or a tenosynovitis in this case, would be inflammation of the lining around that tendon. So that kind of gives us an idea that there is inflammation in that area. But what sort of tendon or what sort of lining are we talking about? In our hand, a lot of people know that we have tendons that start in the elbow or forearm and they travel down, and depending on which joint they're working on, depends on where they stop. But we don't just have a whole bunch of floppy tendons going through our arm and in our hand. In order to actually create motion, this is a physics thing, there are actually what we call pulleys. So pulleys are like little rings or little ring systems, and they're at different levels in the finger. And there's a whole bunch of them that these tendons will travel under, almost like a tunnel system, okay? So normally we have smooth gliding of these tendons through these pulleys or ring systems. But in the case of inflammation or a tenosynovitis or a trigger finger or a trigger thumb, there's inflammation in that area. Now that inflammation can happen because there was swelling, so let's say overuse. I know we use that term a lot, but if we've been using it a lot, we have tight grip, tight muscles, things that are, it's already a confined space, not that much room. So if we're adding extra inflammation in that region, there's really not going to be a lot of space. So sometimes it's also from swelling in the region. Sometimes there's been trauma or injury to the area, side effects from medication. Truly, there's actually a whole bunch of reasons why a trigger finger might happen. But nonetheless, what happens is we have now inflammation and friction as these tendons are trying to travel through those pulleys. As they're traveling through, they're starting to rub, create friction, and eventually get these little micro tears in the area. So think about those cords you plug into the wall if the endings start to get frayed, and we'd wrap it up with electrical tape. In a way, that's kind of a visual. You get these little frayed endings. So these little frayed endings or micro tears in the area, your body's actually pretty good at healing itself. So it thinks, what should I do? Aha, I'm going to lay down some scar tissue and repair the area. So your body, in its wisdom, will lay down fresh scar tissue to where these little micro tears are to try to patch it up. But while it's doing that, if we go back to that very tight area of the pulley with the tendons already in tight space, and now we're adding a bunch of scar tissue, what happens? Well, what happens is as that tendon's gliding through the pulleys, we start to get more friction. We eventually get more micro tears, and then your body eventually lays more scar tissue down. What happens? In that tight area, more scar, more friction, more inflammation and micro tears, you get the picture. Eventually, in a trigger finger, you might actually even start to feel little tender nodules or almost little tender lumps or bumps of that scar tissue. So when you press them, you're like, ow, those are tender. And what happens is if one of these little lumps or bumps of scar tissue, one of these nodules as they're traveling through, gets stuck in that pulley, you can't move until you free it, it hurts, and then you can bend again. So a true full trigger finger is, for example, when that finger is stuck because that little nodule is stuck and it's not free until you almost pry it free, for example, in the morning, and then you can move it again until or unless it gets stuck again. So now we have an understanding of what a trigger finger is. That will give us an idea of what the heck we can do if we have a trigger finger. So if we understand that every time that nodule gets stuck, we create more scar that could potentially get stuck again, then it would serve to think that the first thing we need to do is prevent more scar from forming and let your body clear up the scar tissue that's already there. How do we do that? Well, if you go to see your hand therapist would have a whole bunch of ideas for you. But I'm going to go through a couple of the main and most common ones that sometimes maybe a hand therapist thinks is actually common, but might not be so common knowledge. A lot of the research shows that in order to prevent that finger from getting stuck, and i.e. to prevent more scar tissue from forming, all we need to do is block the motion at one finger joint. Doesn't really matter which one, but your hand therapist and you can decide which one is the most appropriate for you. Sometimes they will block and actually make a little splint that you wear that will block this big knuckle. So you'll be able to bend at the little knuckles, but this big knuckle is going to stay straight. That type of splint is very common to wear, especially at nighttime. It can be the most comfortable. So they might make, using thermoplastic, a splint to block off that joint. It might be held on by Velcro, for example. Another common joint, your hand therapist might make a splint that will block off the joint, the motion in the middle joint. So that would mean you can still bend at the tip, you can bend at the big one, but the little one in the middle doesn't bend. That's also a common splint to make. Sometimes you don't even actually make a splint. You might even wear something called an oval 8 or one of these splints that you can either buy from your hand therapist, or they can tell you places online that you might be able to buy it, or in another store if they don't have it. So these splints are actually made according to ring size. So if you know the ring size of your finger, you would know what size of splint you need to wear. Instead of wearing it traditionally, where we have the two ends at the top and the one end at the bottom, what you actually do is we flip it upside down and we wear it this way. So if I slide that onto my culprit finger, you'll see that it actually blocks the motion at that middle joint. I can still move at the top, I can still bend at the bottom, but that middle joint is prevented from fully contracting and therefore prevents that tendon from that little scar tissue from getting stuck and preventing it from triggering or locking. So the nice part about these splints is they're a very low profile, just a slim plastic design. So they're actually fairly convenient, not so bulky, and sometimes just easier for you to stick to the plan of wearing all the time. You can wash them with soap and water, and if you ever have to wear gloves, like nitrile gloves at work, you can just glove right over them and still do whatever it is you need to do. So they're also a nice convenient option as well. Now, you do have another joint in the finger, this little one. This one I would say usually isn't the one we block. We tend to use that joint a lot for fine motor things like pens, writing, all the dexterity. So we usually won't splint that finger joint. So now you know we're going to be splinting as the first line of offense against the trigger finger. You want to know how long to splint for? Well, that really depends. We want to splint until that inflammation settles. You're probably looking at a few weeks, but that's going to be something you check in with your hand therapist to make sure you know how long you should still wear it and if you can stop wearing it. The next thing we're going to talk about is, if you are wearing the splint all the time, is there any other exercises or anything you can do? Well, of course there are, and depending on each person and their case, those exercises might change or fluctuate a little bit, but I'm going to go through a couple of things that I would definitely want you to do because you're wearing the splint all the time. So since you're wearing the splint, that finger is going to get a little bit stiff. So what I do want you to do is take that splint off periodically and actually do just some kind of passive ragdoll motion on there, just to make sure that that joint isn't getting too stiff. Now, the other thing that you can do as far as exercises go, we talked about some of that scar in that area, or the scar nodules. So what you can do is actually massage those little nodules, depending where they are, massaging in and around that area. Now you want to make sure when you're massaging, you're not just rubbing the skin and giving yourself a blister, but I'm applying a firm pressure to move that tissue underneath. When it comes to how much of this massage to do, frankly, the more the merrier. You don't want to torture yourself, but you do want to do a fair amount if you can. Same goes with the pressure. Firm, but not enough to hurt yourself, and not too light that, you know, it's what I call one of those foo-foo massages where you're not doing too much, okay? After you've done some massage on the area, you can also do an exercise of active motion. So active motion, what you want to do is press firmly on that nodule, wherever it might be, and then go to bend the finger as far as you can. But you must do it with that firm pressure on there. That firm pressure makes sure that that little nodule or no scar tissue is getting stuck underneath the pulley. And therefore, it makes sure that you're not going to trigger or lock again. Because every single time you lock that finger, you're going 2 steps backward before, all the exercise you're doing is going little steps forward. So very important, do not let that finger lock. It's not a party trick. Refrain from showing your friends how your finger locks. And the hardest part, refrain from checking yourself. I know you want to check. You're like, oh, I wonder if it's still doing it. Don't check. Wear the splint, do the exercises, and then your hand therapist can check in a few weeks' time. But very important, please don't let it lock, because then you're just making this problem last longer. Now, if splinting isn't an option for you, so in some folks you might be allergic to plastic, or it might just not be accessible and you can't find one. What you can do is even use something like tape. So this type of tape is stretchy tape. The nice part is there's no glue, no adhesives, it just sticks to itself. You'll hear it called Coban, Coflex, vet wrap if you ever had a little doggo with a rolled ankle and you had to wrap their ankle up with vet wrap. So if you take some of this, you just cut it off a roll, and all you want to do is, I kind of just stretch it around and I wrap it around that finger joint. Now, it's not going to be nearly as rigid as a plastic brace or splint, but what it can help you do is be a little bit more mindful. So when I go to do something and I feel it, I'm reminded, oh yeah, that's right. I don't want to clench and make that finger lock or catch right now. So it might be enough just to remind you, especially if you're catching your finger, oops, bad pun, especially if you're catching that trigger finger early, before it's catching frequently or even at all. If it just feels like that motion is kind of what I say sticky or not very smooth and supple. So there you have it. A couple of things that you can do for trigger finger. So to recap, most important is you want to brace or splint or immobilize at least one joint in your finger for an extended period of time, virtually full time, okay? You're going to take that brace or that tape off, and you're going to do some ragdoll motion to ensure that that joint doesn't stiffen up. You're going to do firm pressure massage over where that scar tissue or that nodule is. And then you're going to do some active range of motion where I pinch firmly to ensure that it doesn't lock whilst I do the active range of motion exercises. And then when you're done, you make sure you put this back on so that you don't go backwards from all your hard work and efforts. So trigger finger, a little bit more common than we probably realized before, but now you have a really good idea of what it is and how to manage it. Definitely and advisable, I do say follow up with your hand therapist so that you know exactly which exercises you might need to add to your program, and also when you can start to wean out of that brace or that splint. If you have any questions for me, drop me a line down below and ask me a question, give me your comments or feedback if you tried anything, or even if you have an idea of what you'd like me to chat about next. So until next time, thanks for joining me, and bye-bye.